Welcome to Age, Pension, Super and Retirement. I am your host, Yvonne, and as always, this is information only and not personal advice. In today's episode, we will be looking at relationships and bereavement in relation to Centrelink and the age pension. I'd like to welcome back the very knowledgeable Rebecca.
Thanks, Yvonne. It's good to be here again.
Let's get to it, Rebecca. First of all, how could someone contact Centrelink if there is a bereavement?
Yeah, so obviously when somebody's died, it's a really difficult time and there's lots of things going on, and maybe Centrelink is the last of your concerns. But if it's your spouse or your child, if you're the responsible person, then it sort of is your duty to inform Centrelink. The funeral company will often offer to do this for you as part of their service. They can tell all the relevant agencies about the death of the person. But if you want to do it yourself, then the best way is to call the Older Australians line, which is 132 300. And if you say, when you're prompted to say, what is the reason for your call? If you say bereavement, or if you say someone has died, then that's kind of the code word to get through to a specialist team of people. They are the bereavement team, and they are specially trained to deal with this issue. So they're really compassionate and kind people. It's not the general front desk team that you get. These people, they know what they're doing and they know what they're there for. They're going to be sensitive to what's going on. So the key word is someone has died or bereavement, and then that will tell the computer this is what we're talking about, and it'll go straight through to that team. And then they will ask you who has died, the details. There is an advice of death form that you can download and send that in. The easiest is probably to call, and that should get you through pretty quickly to somebody who is trained to deal with death and bereavement.
Thank you, Rebecca. That is so helpful to know. Can I ask, Rebecca, does Centrelink pay for a funeral?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question and something that comes up in Facebook groups all the time. So if someone has died, they've been on Centrelink for some time, is Centrelink going to pay for the funeral? And the answer is no. Centrelink doesn't pay for any expenses after a person has died. So it's kind of callous in a way to think that Centrelink doesn't care about you anymore, but the reality is Centrelink is there to support living expenses for someone who, when they're alive, they've got expenses that need to be paid. And once a person has died, the responsibility ends. There is no responsibility from the government or the taxpayer to pay for anything else. What happens is Centrelink will pay one final payment covering the fortnight in which the person died into the person's bank account. So their normal fortnightly payment will come in for that fortnight and then nothing more. So Centrelink does not pay for a funeral. There is, however, in some circumstances, Centrelink does pay some money to the people who were left behind after someone has died. But it doesn't apply to every person who has died. So in some situations, there'll be some money that comes from Centrelink, but in other situations, there are not. So Centrelink does not pay for a funeral. There's no funeral payment that you can get from Centrelink, but there is some help available. We'll circle back to this later on, but Centrelink does not pay for people's funerals.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. What is the bereavement payment?
So I mentioned there in some situations, there is some money available. The important distinction is it's a bereavement payment. So it's a payment to cover the bereavement period. Again, it's not a payment for funeral expenses. People can use this money for whatever they like, and some people do use it for a funeral, but it's not the same amount for each situation. So it's not something you can rely on that if dad dies, Centrelink's going to pay this amount of money, so therefore we can sort out the funeral. It doesn't work like that. Centrelink's looking at who's left behind when a person dies and what is their situation like, and do they reasonably need some money to help the transition period. So it's really about this transition period between when the person's alive and the person's gone. For example, if you've got an elderly parent who's being cared for by an adult daughter, and say they're living together, and if the elderly parent dies, the adult daughter has been on carer payment, providing care for their parent. When the parent dies, realistically, that carer payment has to stop because they're no longer providing that care for the person. But if you were to take away that payment immediately, it really leaves the carer in the lurch. Mum just died and suddenly I've got no money coming in from Centrelink. That's not really a fair situation to just pull that rug out immediately. So Centrelink allows the person on carer payment to stay on the payment for this bereavement period and giving them some time to grieve, to sort out their situation and sort out some other employment or whatever it is. So the payment's really to cover that transition period. In a situation where there's a couple on Centrelink payments and one of them dies, the bereavement payment is to, again, cover that transition between both being on payments from Centrelink to only one of you getting a payment from Centrelink. And to do that immediately, if you're used to a certain amount of money coming in every fortnight, $1,700 a fortnight, and then suddenly that's gone and you're down to a single payment, that's a big adjustment to make when everything else is really difficult and you're trying to sort everything out. So the bereavement payment covers that transition period, but there is an option to have that paid as a lump sum. So for a couple, it's a difference between the amount you get as a couple and the amount the surviving spouse gets as a single person for 14 weeks. So it's just that difference multiplied by 14 weeks paid as a lump sum. So it's going to be different for each situation. It's not a certain amount that you can go, this dollar amount is what we're going to get. It's important to note that we're talking about age pension. And if the person who died and their partner has been on a pension, then this will be all sorted out. You get this bereavement payment. For people who are on allowances, so job seeker or parenting payment, you have to be on that allowance for 12 months for it to be eligible for this bereavement payment. So if you'd only been on the payment for a few weeks, you wouldn't qualify for the bereavement payment. The other situation where the bereavement payment is paid is if you have a dependent child or a baby who has died. And again, it's not a payment for the funeral. Some people would use it for a funeral, but it's really an acknowledgement of the transition between getting money each fortnight for that child that's in your care, or for a baby expecting to have this baby and get the financial support for it, and to then have that suddenly stop is a bit mean. So they give you sort of 14 weeks worth of payment to cover that transition period. And you can use that money for whatever you need in that time. And I kind of say it's not for the funeral because in most situations it's not going to be enough money to pay for a funeral. Funerals are quite expensive and the money that Centrelink pays is not really going to cover that. There is some money available in some circumstances. So if you are a partner or the carer of the person who has died, then you can expect that there will be some money coming from Centrelink, assuming that you and the other person are actually on Centrelink payments.
Such a great clarification, Rebecca. Thank you. What other support is there for people on Centrelink if someone has passed away?
Yeah, so I've talked about the financial support available. There might be some other situations. Maybe somebody is on a unemployment benefit and they are trying to find jobs, maybe doing training, and then a person close to them dies. In that bereavement period, Centrelink understands that you're grieving, especially if it's an unexpected thing. Things are in a bit of turmoil and you might not be able to concentrate on looking for work. So they do offer a temporary exemption from those obligations to look for work. And in the immediate period, you can tell Centrelink and show evidence that this person that's close to you has died. They'll be able to give you a temporary exemption from your obligations. If it's sort of going on for a longer period, it would be best to see your GP and get a Centrelink medical certificate, which shows what's going on and that you are significantly affected and not able to do your usual look for work activities. And then you can be exempted for a period of time. Not really talking about families much on this podcast, but if you use childcare and you're getting childcare subsidy and you've lost a child or your partner, then you may be eligible for fully subsidised childcare for 13 weeks. So this is a thing called additional childcare subsidy temporary financial hardship. So when the death of a child or a partner has caused an impact on your income, which if your partner's died, it's going to definitely affect your income because your partner's income is no longer there. If your child has died and that means you're not able to work or your partner's not able to work, that's going to mean a drop in income. So you can apply for a temporary relief on your childcare subsidy. So you'll get basically free childcare for 13 weeks to allow that grieving time to happen. The other thing is if you weren't on Centrelink and then you suffered the loss of a partner, maybe you are now eligible for Centrelink, so you can apply for that. And when there's been a death that's caused that, the Centrelink will usually get onto that pretty quickly to make sure that you've got some income coming in.
That is so helpful to know, Rebecca. Thank you. I'm curious, is the age pension reversionary?
No, it is not. It's an interesting question because some pensions that people get maybe from an employer or from their super, some pensions are reversionary. So, when the person who's named to get that pension dies, then maybe the whole pension or maybe a part of it goes on to be paid to the spouse or perhaps the child, and that payment continues. Age pension is not like that. Age pension is for the person named to be getting it. It's only for that person, and when a person dies, there's no more age pension paid to that person, and it does not convert or revert to a spouse or a child. It just stops. I had a question come from someone who was in Southeast Asia, and she had married an Australian and he was on age pension. So he was getting his pension payments from Australia and he became sick. She cared for him until his death. And then she was contacting Facebook group in Australia saying, how can I get my husband's age pension? He's died. I need his pension to continue because I was caring for him. And unfortunately for her, I don't know why or how she assumed it would continue after his death. Age pension does not continue to be paid to a spouse or to a child. It just stops. I'm guessing that other countries might have different arrangements where the pension continues to be paid to the surviving spouse, but not in Australia. That's not how it works.
That's so interesting, Rebecca, and interesting that people are reaching out to the Facebook group for all these interesting questions. Rebecca, what happens with couples if both were on the age pension and one dies?
Yes, so as a couple, you're assessed on the partnered income and asset test, and you're each paid your rate based on that. When one person of the couple dies, the surviving spouse then has to transfer from the couple rate over to the single rate. So Centrelink will reassess the rate. They'll look at what your assets are now that your spouse has died and what your income is. Now, for some people, the assets and the income remains exactly the same because everything was held jointly. For some couples, whether it's the person's super might be set to go to a person other than the surviving spouse, so that super might go out of the asset pool, or perhaps the person's will directed certain assets that were held in the individual name to go to other people that not the surviving spouse. So in that situation, the amount of assets the surviving spouse has might be less than they had as a couple. So anyway, Centrelink will reassess the payment rate and will start to pay the surviving spouse based on the single income and asset test. So a lot of people, that's going to mean a reduction in the total amount paid by Centrelink just because of how the income and assets tests work. Sometimes it means that the surviving spouse is not eligible for a Centrelink payment anymore if their assets are below the partnered limit but above the single limit. So yeah, it may mean that that person's no longer eligible for a Centrelink payment. If that's the case, maybe they can apply for a concession card instead. And if that's going to happen, it would be really helpful to get professional financial advice as to what you can do now with your money, because for some people, just the security of having that regular payment coming in from Centrelink is so important, and it can just really shake your world to not have that payment coming in anymore. And so you talk to a financial advisor and they'll be able to, using your assets, set up a regular payment that replaces the pension and can just make you feel a lot more comfortable again. And as I mentioned before, so if both people have been on pension, there is a payment for that bereavement period. So it's 14 weeks. The amount that you would get as a couple compared to the amount that you get as a single person, that can either be paid ongoing for those 14 weeks so that you just get the same payment for that time and allowing you to transition. And then after 14 weeks, it reverts back to the single rate. Or you can request to get that payment as a lump sum. So Centrelink will do the calculation and work out what's the difference between those payment rates and pay you that 14 weeks worth in one payment, which then you could use towards funeral expenses, or maybe you want to take a holiday or whatever it is that you want to do with that money. It's up to you. So if there's been a delay in telling Centrelink that the person has died, then the 14 weeks is going to be less than that because you've sort of already run into that period. So Centrelink will calculate, what's left out of that 14-week period and pay you that.
That's a great clarification. Thank you, Rebecca. And is there any funeral assistance?
Yes, so we said earlier that Centrelink does not pay for funerals, and they don't. There's no Centrelink fund for funerals. But each state or territory has their own funeral assistance program. So in some situations, there literally is no money for a funeral. The person has no funds, their family has no money, and there's no money for a funeral. So each state does have funeral assistance available, which provides for a very no-frills funeral, very simple service, but it's respectful and it allows for the person to be remembered and acknowledged with dignity. So each state has their own program for this. So we'll put a post up in the Facebook group with the details of how to contact each service in each different state. It's really important to note that this funeral assistance is for when there is no money for a funeral. So you can't access funeral assistance after the fact. If someone in the family has already agreed to pay for a funeral, they've signed a contract, paid a deposit, whatever, you will not be able to get funeral assistance because you've already said, I can afford the funeral, I've signed the contract. So it can only be done before anyone has agreed to pay for a funeral. And it's only done when there is literally no money. So it's not a way to get around having to pay. But when there is really no funds for a funeral, this can be done. There may be community groups that you're connected with that may have funds for funerals as well. So if you can ask around, think about, what the person was connected to. There may be some funds available. I know in Victoria, if the death is a result of a traffic incident, then the traffic authority pay for a funeral and there's funds available for that. Now, I'm sure that would be the same in all states. So depending on the circumstances of the death, there may be a body that can pay for the funeral. Funeral assistance is available for a very simple funeral, but simple but respectful service. Yeah, it has to be sorted out before anyone has agreed to pay. I see in the Facebook group sometimes people who say, oh, I had to pay this much for my brother's funeral and now I've got no money and I'm in a bind. Would like to see people not commit themselves to something that they truly can't afford to do. And it's obviously a really emotional time, but if you don't have the money to pay for a funeral, then don't sign up for something that you genuinely can't afford to pay. There's going to be another way around it.
Such valuable information, Rebecca. Thank you so much. Now, a couple of questions we're going to have on relationship status. Rebecca, could you explain how Centrelink determines relationship status?
For Centrelink, there's the two main categories. There is single and partnered. When you apply for a Centrelink payment, you'll be asked to declare your relationship status. Are you single? Are you separated? Are you married? Are you in a de facto relationship? If you declare that you are in a relationship, in a marriage or a de facto relationship or a registered relationship, then Centrelink usually accept that. If you say you're partnered, then they're going to accept that you're partnered. And if you say you're single, they will generally accept that you're single. But sometimes people don't understand the Centrelink definition of a partnership. Sometimes people are trying to dodge the system and think that they're going to get a higher rate of payment if they lie about their relationship status. So Centrelink does have a few checks in the system to make sure that you are telling the truth about your situation. So with the partnership declaration, don't shoot yourself in the foot. If you are in a relationship with someone but it doesn't meet the Centrelink definition of a partnership, then don't declare them as a partner. So Centrelink says that a relationship is a marriage-like relationship. So if you're married, then definitely you need to declare your spouse as your partner. If you are in a registered relationship, so that's like where you've registered your relationship, it's not a marriage, but you have signed this paperwork saying that you are registering for your relationship formally, then that counts as a relationship, as a partnership. Or if you are in a de facto relationship. So that means that you are living together with someone in a marriage-like relationship, but there's no piece of paper signed. So if you are living with a partner, then you're going to be considered partnered by Centrelink. If you are in a relationship where you don't live together, you've never lived together, you don't share any finances, then you are probably not considered partnered by Centrelink. So that might be if you've got a new relationship and you've never formalized it, you've never moved in together, and you're just happy having boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. I guess the language that we use, it's interesting because I feel like we generally refer to someone as, oh, this is my partner, when there might not be actually a, committed living together relationship. And I don't know, Yvonne, if you've seen this, but people, I feel like they don't really use girlfriend, boyfriend terms anymore, at least not when you're maybe over 50. Yeah, so you might refer to this person as your partner, but if you've never lived with them and you don't share finances, if you do your own money and they do their own money, then you're probably considered single. So don't put someone's name down as partnered if you are not actually partnered by Centrelink's definition. The other thing to consider with that is if you are separated, then you need to say that you're separated. So if you've been in a de facto or marriage relationship and you now are not in that relationship anymore, Centrelink are going to need to know that you are separated and not single. So single technically means you've never been in a de facto or marriage relationship. So that's one thing. So don't declare someone as a partner when they're not actually your partner. Then the other thing is, if you are living together with someone and they're not your partner, if you've got someone who is like a housemate or a friend that you share your home with, they're probably not a partner either. When you claim a Centrelink payment, you'll be asked to say, is there anyone else who lives in your house or that you share the house with? And so you'll need to put the names of the people who live with you in there, and you'll need to say what your relationship is with that person. So maybe this is George and he's my brother, or this is Mary and she is a housemate. And you do need to declare that you have never been in a marriage-like relationship with that person. And sometimes Centrelink will send out a form to complete for that other person that you live with to complete, just to confirm that the relationship is not a marriage-like relationship. And it can be a bit funny sometimes to think like, why is Centrelink sending me this form to say that I am not in a relationship with my brother? Maybe you have the same name, or maybe you have different names, and they just need to check that it's all above board and you're not in a relationship that you're not telling Centrelink about. So where are we up to? So sometimes people have lived with a spouse or a partner and they are now separated, but they continue to live in the same house. So this is a situation called separated under one roof. And Centrelink recognises that while I guess the norm is that when the relationship's over, one of you will move out, or you'll both move out and sell the house and go and find other accommodation. But sometimes there's not an opportunity to do that. Maybe neither of you have the funds to be able to move out. Maybe you're staying in the same house because there's a care relationship that one of you provides care for the other person who's got a disability. So Centrelink does appreciate that in some situations you have been a couple, you have ended the relationship, the couple relationship, but you are still living in the same house. But as you can imagine, this is a situation that's probably open to a bit of cheekiness from people to say that they are separated when they're actually still a couple. So Centrelink does go through a lot of questions. If you're going to say, yeah, I live in the same house with my ex-partner, we're still both here, but we're not in a relationship anymore, we're just like housemates now, they will go through a big list of questions to figure out, are you or are you not? And we had a question in the group just recently where someone had said, my ex-partner and I are still living in the same home. I applied for Centrelink and said I was separated. They did the forms and they came back and they said that Centrelink consider us to still be partnered. That was an interesting one because when you read through the post and the responses, it was quite clear that they were still talking about themselves as we, our retirement, our investment property. We plan to do this, we plan to do that. And it really did look like they were still thinking as a couple, making decisions, financial decisions together as a couple. So I can understand why Centrelink said you might be physically separated, you're in different bedrooms, but you're still financially thinking like a couple and acting like a couple. So financial things is one of the things that Centrelink will look at to determine whether you're still a couple or not. And I'll just find my page because I found the official list of things. There's 5 factors to a relationship that Centrelink look at to determine whether you're a member of a couple or not. This is for when you are still living in the same house and you're trying to tell Centrelink that we are separated now and I want to claim payments as a single person. So they look at the financial aspects of the relationship, the nature of the household, social aspects, any sexual relationship, and the nature of the commitment. So there's no one factor that's going to decide yes or no. They sort of look at the whole situation and looking at how much is your life like a married couple and how is it different to a married couple. So like the financial aspects of the relationship, it's looking at, are you pooling resources? Are you deciding together how to spend money? Are you splitting up household expenses similar to how a married couple would do it? So it might be you pay the mortgage, I pay all the other bills. You pay this bill, I pay that bill. Some couples do have separate finances. They have separate bank accounts and maybe they've always had separate bank accounts. So that having separate bank accounts in itself does not determine whether you're a couple or not. It's more about how do you decide what to do with your money. If one of you was sick, would the other one cover the expenses? How does that play out? Then they look at the nature of the household. So in the house, who lives in what rooms? Are you sharing living spaces? Are you sharing a bedroom? Who uses the kitchen? What times do you use the kitchen? And they're really looking at, are you living together, doing things together, or are you living more like housemates where you each have your own space and you do things separately. They look at social aspects, like do you present as a couple to society? If someone assumes that you're a couple, what do you do? Do you correct them? Do you say, oh, yes, we were married, now we're separated? If someone invites you to a party, do they expect that your ex-partner will come? Do they think that you're a couple? And Centrelink does look at things like cultural factors that may mean that somebody presents to family as a couple when they're not actually a couple. So they do look at cultural factors, and they do look at domestic violence as well that may impact how people present socially compared to what's happening at home. Then they look at sexual relationship too. It's not that Centrelink needs to know what you're doing in your sex life, but is your relationship like a marriage relationship where there is a understood commitment to each other, an exclusive relationship, or has that finished and you have other partners, etc. They're looking at then the nature of the commitment. Is there like an emotional attachment to each other? Is that different in terms of how you might relate to a sibling or a housemate? What's going on in the relationship? So there's a lot of different things that they look at, and there's a form that you have to fill in called the Separated Under One Roof form. And if you look at the questions on there, they do ask lots of questions, quite invasive questions about what's going on in your life to determine whether you are in fact single, separated, as you have claimed that you are, or do you need to be treated as a member of a couple. I'm sure the Centrelink workers don't like doing this, but the legislation has different rules for couples and different rules for singles, so it has to be done.
Rebecca, that was an amazing answer and so interesting to hear about separated under one roof. Thank you so much for covering that so extensively. Finally, how does Centrelink treat couples living separately due to illness?
Yeah, so this is another situation where the relationship has changed and maybe you need to be assessed differently by Centrelink. So if you've got a couple where one person has to go into care, typically talking about nursing home type care. So you were in the home together on a couple rate pension, and that was usually enough to cover your expenses. But when one person has to move into a nursing home, you've now effectively got two households to support. You've got the remaining spouse, maybe in the family home, who's got to cover all the same bills as before. And then you've got the person who's moved into aged care who has to pay the daily fee in aged care and sometimes more fees besides. And it's not really something that you can expect to cover. So Centrelink has this category called a couple separated by illness. You're still assessed as a couple and you're still assessed on your combined assets and income, but the rates paid to you change and you're both paid a single rate pension based on half of your combined assets. That allows for you to both have a reasonable standard of living, even though you're living separately in those sort of two separate households. For some people, that means that when you haven't been on a pension before, once somebody moves into care, the assets change because maybe you've paid a bond or the refundable accommodation deposit, and then that changes your assessable assets. So some people become eligible for a Centrelink payment after one person has moved into care, and for other people, it's changing from that couple rate to both getting the single rate of pension. It's important to note that you're not actually considered single. You're still a couple, but you're paid a higher rate in acknowledgement of that you're basically running two households. But there's like a group of people who they actually do need to be considered separated when that happens. So if somebody moves into nursing home care because they've got dementia or something like that, some cognitive impairment, it can be to the point where that person is no longer really able to be in a relationship. They're not cognitively able to participate in that relationship and be a full member of a couple. So Centrelink acknowledges that in some situations, the fairest thing to do is to consider those two people separated for social security purposes. It's really important that it is for social security purposes separated, because it doesn't mean that legally that the two people are not a couple anymore. It doesn't change anything that might be in a will. It doesn't change visiting rights for a person to visit their spouse in care. But there are some situations where it just would not be fair to consider the people still a couple for Centrelink purposes after the person has moved into a nursing home. And there's a post that I've put on the group which discusses this in more detail. But for an example, let's say you've got a couple where there's a decent age gap, say they're 12 years apart in age. Let's say the younger partner is 58 and the older partner is 70. And let's say the older partner develops Parkinson's disease or dementia and they're cognitively deteriorated to a point where they don't recognize their partner anymore. They're really not doing well at all cognitively. And they might move into a nursing home. And then you've got the spouse that's 58 and healthy and fit. And what are they going to do? They need the fees for the nursing home need to be paid, and they're no longer eligible for carer payment because their spouse has gone into care. So what can they do? They're too young to access their super. They're too young to go on age pension, and they could apply for job seeker payment, and that would be one option. And that's fine. You can apply for job seeker payment and look for jobs or volunteer and maybe wait for your spouse to die. And after that, things would change. But some people might want to go back into the workforce. And if you understand about how the income and asset tests work, in that situation, somebody who is 58 and has a spouse in aged care and they're both on a Centrelink payment, they would effectively be working only to pay a higher rate of aged care fees. And it just really wouldn't make any sense for the person to go out and work when that income is almost all going to be taken up by the aged care fees and a reduction in the pension that their spouse who's in care gets. So that really seems to be an unfair situation. Like, why would you go to work when that's all that's going to happen? So in that situation, probably the fairest thing to do to encourage the person to work and to make sure that the person in care still has income, the fairest thing to do is to separate them on paper for social security purposes, classed as separated. So that means the person in care keeps their part of the assets and gets a single rate pension based on their situation. And then the spouse who is healthy can go to work, earn their income, and their income just comes to them, and their income does not go to pay the aged care fees.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was just such a full response and a reminder that this is always information only and never personal advice. For our international listeners wishing to join our Facebook group, the code word is orange. Rebecca, thank you so much for passing on this valuable information to all our listeners.
You're welcome. There's a lot of wordy stuff in there, but I hope it's been able to be understood and helpful for people.
It's just wonderful. I'll speak to you again soon, and bye to everyone for now.